Now, last year's Neville Kennard address, as some of you may recall, was delivered by the Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, John Mearsheimer. And his argument was that the US focus on Ukraine and the Middle East hurts the US pivot to Asia, which is primarily designed to address the far more greater security threat in China. Now, Mearsheimer, contrary to his critics, did not advocate a new isolationism. His realist foreign policy approach instead stressed an unsentimental focus on national interests, pursued with a prudent calculation of commitments and resources. Even a great power like the United States, he argued, has finite resources and not every option is available. If the US does not discriminate and recognise its limits in a complicated world that does not conform to American expectations, the US could get bogged down in quagmires just like it did in Vietnam and Iraq. That was John Mearsheimer's view at Consilium, and that lecture subsequently was turned into a lecture at Brisbane shortly afterwards, which attracted nearly 2 million views on YouTube. Well, tonight we will hear a radically different point of view. Niall Ferguson, as we've already recognised throughout Consilium over the last 24 hours, is one of the world's greatest and most prolific historians and public intellectuals. He's been at Harvard and Stanford, educated at Oxford, and Niall has also been a prominent writer and journalist for many esteemed publications, from Bloomberg, the London Times and the New York Times, to the UK Spectator, the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and the Australian newspaper where I had the great pleasure of publishing Niall more than 20 years ago. Niall is author of several best-selling books: Empire, How Britain Made the Modern World; Colossus, The Rise and Fall of the American Empire; Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe; and The Ascent of Money, A Financial History of the World. He's also in the process of completing the second volume of the Henry Kissinger biography. Niall is also the founder and managing director of Greenmantle. It's an advisory firm, and one of their research scholars, Alice Hahn, some of you may recall, was our scholar in residence in 2022. To help make sense of today's world and to challenge the John Mearsheimer worldview, it is a great pleasure to welcome the 2024 Neville Kennard Address by Niall Ferguson.
That is so not my theme music. Can we have bagpipes next time, gentlemen? What now for the liberal world order? Well, we're approaching, ladies and gentlemen, as we were reminded last night, the 50th anniversary of the founding of this great institution in 1976. It's also 50 years since Henry Kissinger had to ask himself if the United States should give up on Australia. The Labour leader Gough Whitlam was Prime Minister, as you all know. His relationship with Kissinger was not an easy one, to say the least. True, in 1971, they were aligned on bringing China back into the international system. Indeed, they almost bumped into one another in Beijing in July of that year. But Whitlam was most of the time a thorn in Kissinger's side. Even before his election, he'd long argued for pulling the plug on Australia's involvement in Vietnam. In a letter dated December 20th, 1972, he was highly critical of the US bombing of North Vietnam. Whitlam wrote that Australia might join other East Asian countries in, quote, addressing a public appeal to both the United States and North Vietnam to return to serious negotiations for peace. As James Curran describes in his excellent book, Unholy Fury, a seething Kissinger picked up the phone and was put through to the ambassador's number 2. The ambassador was out of town. If you could convey, said Kissinger, that we are not particularly amused at being put by an ally on the same level as our enemy. I must tell you, it's not the way to start a relationship with us. I'll stop doing the voice now. You get the general idea. On December 29th, on the phone to Kissinger from Camp David, Nixon, these phone calls are part of the joy of writing this biography. Nixon called Whitlam a peacenik. Kissinger agreed that the Australian leader was, quote, hardly a heavyweight. Kissinger called Whitlam's letter an absolute outrage. And a cheap little maneuver, I'm quoting, a grandstand play and very dangerous and very stupid too. From the minute the Vietnam War ends, Kissinger said, the Australians will need us one hell of a lot more than we need them. Nixon and Kissinger agreed to freeze out Whitlam for a few months so that he would get the message. Well, it wasn't clear that Whitlam did get the message. So, National Security Study Memorandum 204, dated July 1st, 1974, ordered a review of US policy toward Australia in the light of recent changes in the Labour government. And this review was to deal with, and I quote, the prospects for keeping US defence installations in Australia, the alternatives for relocating essential existing US security functions outside of Australia, and the impact on our alliance relationship of doing so, and the prospects for growing divergence between Australia and US policy in Asia and elsewhere. Well, luckily for Whitlam, Nixon was forced to resign over Watergate just 5 weeks later. There's a nice moment in February 1973 when Nixon and the British Prime Minister, Edward Heath, are trying to make sense of Whitlam. Quote, Prime Minister Heath mentioned, in that part of the world we both had trouble with the Australians. President Nixon said that he too found it hard to understand the Australian position. They should have an interest in keeping us there. He wondered whether Whitlam was an isolationist. Prime Minister Heath thought Whitlam never even thought about this question. He just wanted to stay out of unpleasant situations. Well, I wonder, ladies and gentlemen, just how different things really are today. True, the United States and Australia have deepened their defence relationship in recent years, not least with the advent of the AUKUS agreement, along with the United Kingdom in 2021. True, American and Australian officials like to give fine speeches about upholding the, quote, liberal international order. And yet, below the surface, one senses a growing divergence. Perhaps one sign of this divergence was the warm reception John Mearsheimer was given last year, at least by Tom, when he came to Australia to speak at a CIS event. During his visit, Mearsheimer made two main arguments in his critique of recent American foreign policy. First, Tom's already summarized this, but altogether too positively. First, the United States is wrong to fight for Ukraine's independence and was wrong to expand the North Atlantic Treaty Organization into Central and Eastern Europe after the end of the Cold War. Implicitly, we should have left Russia in control of that part of the world, regardless of the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the eagerness of all its former members to join NATO. Second, Mearsheimer argued that the United States is allowing itself to be distracted, not only by Ukraine, but by the crisis in the Middle East that erupted 2 weeks before he spoke last year, from the strategic challenge posed by a rising China, and should instead be focused on building a balancing coalition of Asian states, including Australia, to contain Beijing's ambitions. Now, I share Mearsheimer's skepticism about the liberal international order, like Voltaire's Holy Roman Empire. You'll remember it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. The liberal international order is not very liberal. It's not even very international, and it's certainly not very orderly. I agree with Mearsheimer that the United States underestimated the geopolitical consequences of China's economic rise and of NATO's expansion. But I profoundly disagree with him, as well as with Elbridge Colby, when they argue that the United States must prioritize the containment of China over the security of democracies in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. And tonight, while you enjoy your main courses, and I look longingly at them, I am going to explain why they are wrong and what it means for Australia. Now, since the end of World War II, debates about American foreign policy have more often been within the two major parties than between them. If you think about this, you'll see the truth of it. The bipartisan consensus in favor of imposing tariffs and technological restrictions on China is only the latest example. The biggest debate on foreign policy we've seen in recent years is the debate within the Republican Party over the wisdom of supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia. The conventional wisdom in Europe today is that the Ukrainian government of Volodymyr Zelensky would be among the biggest losers if Donald Trump were to be re-elected president on November the 5th. To most West European leaders, the news that J.D. Vance had been picked to be Trump's running mate seemed disastrous. And yet, it would be a mistake to assume that this represented a victory for the isolationists, much less the Putin apologists like Tucker Carlson. This came up last night, and so I thought I'd drill down and try and show you what I mean by this. Consider what Vance told the New York Times in an interview with Ross Douthat back in June, in which Vance set out a three-point plan to end the war, quote, with American leadership. And here I'm going to quote JD. Number one, you freeze the territorial lines somewhere close to where they are right now. Number two, you guarantee both Kyiv's independence but also its neutrality. It's the fundamental thing the Russians have asked from the beginning. I'm not naive here, he said. I think the Russians have asked for a lot of things dishonestly, but neutrality is clearly something that they see as existential for them. And then three, there's going to have to be some American security assistance over the long term. Asked by Douthat, quote, you agree it's not in our interest right now for the Russians to roll through the rest of Ukraine? Vance replied, no, it is not in our interest. These are not isolationist but realist arguments, very close in spirit to points made by Henry Kissinger in the last years of his life. Remember, it was after the annexation of Crimea in 2014 that Kissinger argued for creating a neutral Ukraine precisely to avert a full-scale Russian invasion. This return of realism to the Republican Party is long overdue after the overreach of the neocons and the underreach of the isolationists. But it should not be interpreted as a victory for Mearsheimer and Colby. This is the key point. The new realism's most striking feature has been this recognition that the United States faces a new axis that unites Russia with China, Iran, and North Korea. Now, because it's been so overused, the parallel with the 1930s has lost much of its power. When George W. Bush referred in 2002 to Iran, Iraq, and North Korea as an axis of evil, he misled Americans because no such thing existed. But today, and this is what Mearsheimer seems unable to see, we confront a genuine axis that can be and should be compared with the one formed by Germany, Italy, and Japan before and in the early stages of the Second World War. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are all now openly cooperating to support Russia's war effort in Ukraine, supplying Putin's orc army. I love the fact that the Ukrainians call them the orcs, just completely naturally. Oh, the orcs. With a plethora of weapons from drones to missiles to shells, and now even North Korean soldiers. Now, I'm going to claim some credit here for the Hoover Institution because this idea of an analogy with the Axis goes back to work done by my colleague Philip Zelikow and yours truly. What very few commentators have noticed is that this argument is now made by Trump. This is a different world than it was 3.5 years ago, Trump told Bloomberg Business Week in an interview that was published in July. Quote, "The worst thing that happened is we've allowed, because Biden is a stupid person," I'll do the voice, "because Biden's a stupid person, he's forced Russia and China to get married. They're married, so married. Then they took in their little cousin Iran, and then they took in North Korea. They don't need anybody else." And he goes on, "It's a very, very dangerous world." Alec Baldwin, your job is safe. "It's a very dangerous world, so dangerous." He goes on, "I actually worry about the months that we have left, right? I think you could end up in World War III. And he's made this observation on multiple occasions. Now, Trump's central claim about foreign policy is that he was able to deter the Axis, and Biden has failed utterly to do so. In fact, Biden's made the Axis come together. "I will end every single international crisis that the current administration has created," he said in that interminable acceptance speech in Milwaukee. Tonight's speech will be shorter than Trump's acceptance speech at the Republican convention, I promise. But let me just quote some of what he said, because it's very relevant here. He said he'd end every crisis, including the horrible war with Russia and Ukraine, which would never have happened if I was president. I can't help myself. "And the war caused by the attack on Israel, which would never have happened if I was president. Our opponents inherited a world at peace and turned it into a planet of war. We're in a planet of war. Look at that attack on Israel. Look at what's happening with Ukraine. The cities are just bombed out. How can people live like that, where buildings, massive buildings, are falling to the ground? It began to unravel with the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, the worst humiliation in the history of our country. We've never had a humiliation like that. Emboldened by that disaster, Russia invaded Ukraine." end quote. Note to Mearsheimer, not emboldened by NATO enlargement, emboldened by American retreat. This is the language of true realism because it emphasizes deterrence, not de-escalation, which is the functional opposite of deterrence. George Orwell memorably and presciently defined Cold War. He coined the phrase in 1945 as, quote, a peace that is no peace. And his point was that after the advent of the atomic bomb, an all-out hot war between two nuclear-armed superpowers would be appallingly costly. He correctly assumed that the Soviets would soon get a bomb of their own. In Cold War I, we've got to learn to call it that, which ran from the late 40s until the late 80s, we inhabited a binary world. Either there was Armageddon or there wasn't. Everything else, from Korea to Vietnam to Angola, was a peripheral proxy conflict. And below that level, there were all the covert operations. In Cold War II, which began when Americans belatedly noticed that Xi Jinping was intent on challenging their primacy, the situation's different. Because of the proliferation of technologies that were in their infancy in the first Cold War, we now live amid a war that is no war. We know, of course, that Russia is at war with Ukraine, but is it, as Putin argues, also at war with NATO and the other US allies supporting the Ukrainian war effort? And is NATO also at war with China, Iran, and North Korea, with the Axis, all of whom support Russia's war? Is Israel at war with Hezbollah as well as Hamas? Yes, in the sense that Israeli government agencies have killed thousands of Hezbollah operatives, and anyone who purports to lead the organization, that is the worst job in the world. But, and is, of course, Hezbollah is regularly still firing missiles, trying to kill Israelis. But it's not war in the sense that we don't talk about the Third Lebanon War, even although it's going on. Is Israel at war with Iran? I think it is, but it's rarely depicted that way in the media. People don't talk about the Israel-Iran war. They could. Is China at war with Taiwan? No, in the sense that the maneuvers of its ships and its planes in close proximity to the island haven't involved firing shells or missiles at Taiwanese targets, but it's clear that recent Chinese exercises are part of a sustained campaign of psychological warfare directed against Taiwan, and we rarely read about all the cyber and other covert dimensions of that campaign. A Cold War, in other words, is necessarily a latent world war. Had the contest between the United States and the Soviet Union turned hot in 1962 over Cuba, that would have been World War III. And the same is true today. It would not be difficult for Cold War II to become the Third World War. Let me quote from an article published in the Washington Post in June, which cited Admiral Samuel Paparo, the new head of the US Indo-Pacific Command. Quote, "They, meaning the Chinese, want to offer the world a short, sharp war so that it is a fait accompli before the world can get their act together. My job is to ensure that between now and 2027 and beyond, the US military and the allies are capable of prevailing. In response to a Chinese move against Taiwan, I want to turn the Taiwan Strait into an unmanned hellscape using a number of classified capabilities, so that I can make their lives utterly miserable for a month, which buys me the time for the rest of everything. And I'll just let you ponder, as you digest your main courses, what the rest of everything might look like. So wars happen when deterrence fails. They happen when our adversaries hear statements like Paparo's, but are not intimidated. And this was an issue I addressed nearly 2 decades ago in my book, The War of the World. Why was there so much violence in the 20th century? And why was it so heavily concentrated in time, the 1910s and the 1940s, and in space, with a huge proportion of organized lethal violence happening in that terrible triangle of territory between the Baltic Sea, the Balkans, and the Black Sea? It's where an overwhelming percentage of lethal organized violence happened in the 20th century. And the answer is that violence was most likely to occur when economic volatility struck and where empires were in decline, leaving multi-ethnic societies without robust political institutions. And that's why it's not surprising that war is once again raging in Ukraine, a country perhaps more afflicted by organized violence in the past century than any other in the world. All of Russia and Eastern Europe suffered extraordinary economic instability in the period after the collapse of communism. They essentially had a Great Depression. The disintegration of the Soviet Union was a classic case of imperial decline and fall. But the societies it left in its wake were not well equipped to make the most of the new opportunities of individual freedom, free markets, and democracy, the things that CIS is all about. Now, there are parallels here with the end of the First World War. In November 1918, when a revolution replaced the German Empire with the Weimar Republic. It was struck by hyperinflation in 1923 and steep deflation in 1929 to 32, and Hitler was appointed Chancellor in 1933. We all know that. It's where my career began, trying to understand why that happened. Following what I called at the time the Weimar Russia years of the 1990s, and I was there at that time, there gradually emerged, as that analogy implied, a new Muscovite fascism under Putin. Meanwhile, Russia's immediate neighbors, including Ukraine and also Georgia, struggled with flagrant corruption and sheer incompetence, occasionally attempting to clean up their acts with so-called color revolutions. So it was obvious 10 years ago, if not before, that Putin was ready to use brute military force to prevent Ukraine from establishing itself as a stable and prosperous democracy. And yet in 2014, the West responded feebly to his annexation of Crimea and creation of puppet states in parts of the Donbass. And then in 2021, we wholly failed to deter Putin from a full-scale invasion. So, contrary to John Mearsheimer, it was not NATO enlargement that led to war in 2022. That's Putin's line. Doesn't he understand? He's parroting the Kremlin's line. What caused all this to happen was a policy that, particularly in Europe, and especially in Germany, came very close to being appeasement of Russia. And you can make the same kind of argument about the Middle East, which has been plagued by violence and instability ever since the downfall of the Anglo-French mandates that were set up in the region to rule in the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, which had collapsed in 1922. There was a time in the wake of 9/11 when it seemed as if the US was going to establish its own imperial order, extending from Iraq to Afghanistan. But the neoconservative vision of an Americanized greater Middle East was a delusion. It entirely lacked a domestic political foundation. That was the argument I made in a book called Colossus that was written at the time of the Iraq invasion. Today, nobody is in charge in the Middle East. It's certainly not doddering, forgotten President Biden. Nor is it the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, whose grand designs to modernize the kingdom increasingly recall the late Shah of Iran's similar grandiose designs to modernize his in the 1960s and 70s. Nor is it the malignant theocracy that replaced the Shah in 1979. Even Benjamin Netanyahu, with all his Machiavellian cunning, struggles to hold his coalition together in Israel. And that's why, because no one is in charge, terrorist organizations have been able to wreak havoc from the tunnels of Gaza to the bunkers of the Lebanese border. Economically stagnant, despised by its subjugated people, the Islamic Republic of Iran lacks the capacity to do much more than sponsor these murderous bands. And yet, since January 2021, almost nothing has been done to deter Iran from behaving this way. Indeed, we now learn that a mole in the US government has been leaking details of Israeli war plans to Tehran. A scandal that would be on the front page of every newspaper if American newspapers had not become unofficial appendages of the Democratic Party. The question that remains to be answered is whether China will take advantage of Western weakness to ignite a third wildfire in the global forest, either by blockading Taiwan or by picking a fight with the Philippines. It is certainly arming itself, and it is stockpiling raw materials as if it intends a showdown. According to Bill Burns, Director of Central Intelligence, and a man I highly respect and admire, President Xi has told his military leaders to be ready for war by 2027. What I find highly implausible, indeed I find it risible, is that our abandoning Ukraine and pivoting away from the Middle East would discourage Xi from taking a gamble on blockading Taiwan. On the contrary, this would be de-escalation, i.e. anti-deterrence, at its very worst. Today, even with war raging in Ukraine, it's maddeningly difficult to persuade British and German ministers that they need to get serious about rearmament. With Hamas still holding hostages in Gaza and Hezbollah firing missiles at Israel, it's impossible to convince some Labour MPs in London that the problem we need to worry about is Islamist terrorism, not Islamophobia, much less Israeli, quote, settler colonialism. And as this new axis relentlessly adds to its combined nuclear arsenal, it's considered, at least at Stanford, the height of bad taste to suggest that World War III is almost certainly a more imminent threat to humanity than climate change. Deterrence depends on military readiness. Conversely, appeasement is nearly always the policy of a state that would rather avoid the costs of rearmament. And let me give you an example. Today, Germany's regular budget provides for a defense expenditure of only 52 billion euros, which corresponds to around 1.2% of Germany's gross domestic product. That level of spending is comparable to the Weimar era, when the Treaty of Versailles limited Germany's military spending to around 0.9% of its GDP. True, according to the most recent NATO figures, Germany will meet the target of 2% of GDP this year for the first time since that target was introduced 10 years ago. But this is thanks to a temporary special fund, the Sondervermögen, and a few other bits of creative accounting. That number still remains substantially less than the US figure of 3.4% of GDP. Poland now spends 4.1% of GDP on defense. Estonia 3.4%, Latvia 3.2%, even Greece, which a decade ago the average German regarded as a basket case, spends more than 3%. Compare the effort made when Saddam Hussein sought to annex Kuwait back in 1990. Relative to GDP, Germany spent more than 3 times more on liberating Kuwait than it is spending on liberating Ukraine. Total allocated aid from Germany to Ukraine amounts to just 0.37% of GDP. For the US, the figure's 0.35%. For France, 0.16%. For Italy, 0.11%. There's no obvious excuse for this when the Baltic states and Denmark have all allocated more than 1% of their GDP. I was in Kyiv just about 6 weeks ago. There's a really nice pizza place in central Kyiv founded by some war veterans. And one of the things I really like about it is above the bar, it reads, "Si vis pacem para bellum." If you want peace, prepare for war. That is one of history's oldest lessons, and Ukrainians have been learning it the hard way. So let me bring this back to Australia. Is your country learning the lesson of history? Is it preparing for war in order to have peace? I can't hear you. I can't hear you. No. I know, Ukraine, it's a long way. 9,000 miles separate Kyiv from Brisbane. But that doesn't seem to me to justify the paltry scale of Australian support for Ukraine's war of self-defense. To date, total bilateral support has amounted to $720 million US, 0.05% of 2021 GDP. Last year's defense budget was 53 billion Australian dollars, 1.99% of GDP. By NATO standards, you're not meeting the target. Next year, it's true, it's going to rise, 2.03%. That's only a bit better than the figures for Germany and most of the other European members of NATO. By the way, in 1968, Australia's defense budget was 3.5% of GDP, so it has been done. What's really striking to me is how much of the projected increase in Australian defence spending will be absorbed by the nuclear submarine programs that are the first pillar of the AUKUS agreement. Spending on nuclear-powered subs is going to increase by a factor of 10 between last year and 2027-28. Meanwhile, the number of permanent uniformed personnel is down to 58,600. And remember that the first of these submarines are expected to be delivered in the 2040s. That's 20 years after the Taiwan crisis Bill Burns is expecting this decade. As we enter the final phase of the US election campaign, we hear once again the tired old comparison between Donald Trump and Hitler and Mussolini. It's the last desperate throw of the dice. But you know, it seems to me far more plausible to compare Trump with a president he actually sought to cultivate as a young up-and-coming real estate guy in New York City. And guess who that president was? Richard Nixon. See, all my speeches come full circle. This tells you I'm nearly done. I think that you are one of this country's great men, and it was an honor to spend an evening with you, Trump wrote to Nixon after they dined together in June 1982. You can see why there was a sense of kinship much more clearly today. Like Nixon, Trump has been an outsider all his career, looked down on by the Harvard, Manhattan, and Aspen types. Like Nixon, Trump's political ascent occurred despite a state of permanent war with the mainstream media, especially the New York Times, the fake news, and Washington Post. Like Nixon, Trump's political adversaries were not content to challenge him at the ballot box. They had to impeach him using the resources of the Department of Justice to pursue him even after his election defeat in 2020. The difference is that Watergate destroyed Nixon irrevocably. Russiagate did not destroy Trump. As Trump put it 3 years ago, he left. I don't leave. A big difference. Like Nixon, Trump understands the limits of American power and the importance of careful assessment of what is in the national interest and what is not. Like Nixon, Trump inherited a losing war in Afghanistan, not Vietnam, which the military establishment was reluctant to abandon. Like Nixon, Trump sought to improve relations with authoritarian adversaries, even if the foreign policy establishment successfully prevented Trump from going to Moscow, as Nixon famously went to Beijing. And finally, like Nixon, Trump regards most American allies as freeloaders who should pay their way in return for America's friendship and protection. That, after all, was the essence of the Nixon doctrine. And that is why allies, from Germany to Australia, need to brace themselves for the eventuality of a second Trump term. And to understand that this time, and I love saying this, there will be no more Mr. Nice Guy. It's just the idea that there could ever be Mr. Nice Guy with Trump. 50 years, ladies and gentlemen, have passed since Nixon and Kissinger contemplated, as I showed you, a drastic reassessment of the US-Australia relationship. And I am very struck as I travel around this lovely and prosperous country, how few of its citizens realize the potential imminence of a similar reassessment. Perhaps, Tom, in advance of its half-century celebrations, CIS can alert the Labour government to this danger. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen.